Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Anatolian Dispatch, one of several podcasts sponsored by Aval News, your best source of information on all things Turkish. Anatolian Dispatch looks at Turkey's foreign relations, especially, but by no means exclusively, with the United States. Our guest today is retired U.S. Ambassador Alberto M. Fernandez, and he has quite a resume, so please listen up. He is currently Vice President of the Middle East Media Research Institute, a position he held previously from 2015 to 2017. He served from 2017 to 2020 as President of the Middle East Broadcasting Networks, a US-funded Arabic language news organization. Prior to joining MEMRI, or MEMRI as some of us call it, Ambassador Fernandez was Foreign Service Officer from 1983 to 2015. He served, among other positions, as the State Department's coordinator for the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications from 2012 to 2015. He also served as the U.S. Ambassador to Equatorial Guinea and the U.S. Chargé d'Affaires in Sudan. He liked to go to all the luxury spots. He held several senior public diplomacy positions with the State Department in other garden spots, such as Afghanistan, Jordan, Syria, Guatemala, Kuwait, and then the department's Near East Affairs Bureau. He speaks fluent Spanish and Arabic in addition to English. You can follow him via the MEMRI website at memri.org or via his Twitter account at Alberto Miguel F5. So welcome, Alberto.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be on with you.
So as I noted, we look at Turkey's foreign relations, mainly the U.S., but they're in the Middle East, and you're a Middle East expert. So I wanted to get your views on a couple of things, and maybe if we could start with, there are several radical Islamist groups that have parked themselves in Istanbul, and they send out their message to Arabic-speaking worlds. And could you elaborate on your views about this apparent Turkish government support for radical Islamist messaging in Arabic that they spread throughout the Middle East?
Well, thank you. It's a fascinating phenomenon that is generally underreported in English, certainly. When people talk about Turkey or talk about the Erdogan government, there are things that they like or dislike that they may talk about in the West, but this one is one that kind of flies under the radar. But it's a fascinating one because basically what's happened is over the last decade, Turkey has become a safe haven, an oasis of Arabic media, but with a caveat. The interesting thing is that just as the government in Turkey locks up Turkish journalists and shuts down Turkish media, it's become a safe haven for Arabic language media, but not all Arabic language media, not secular Arabic language media, not liberal Arabic language media, but Islamist media. And there are thousands of Arab journalists in Istanbul and dozens of news sites, online sites, and television networks in Arabic that churn a daily dose of poison in Arabic, broadcasts from Turkey to the Arab world and to the Arab diaspora in the West, in Western Europe and elsewhere. So it's really interesting, a really interesting phenomenon. Right now in Turkey, you can find anti-government, meaning anti-Arab government stations with a Syrian focus, a Yemeni focus, an Iraqi focus, a Palestinian focus, a Libyan focus, a Sudanese focus, and especially an Egyptian focus. There are like three big anti-Sisi regime Islamist networks based in Istanbul, churning out now for years, going back 6-7 years, and we can talk about why that happened and how it happened.
Right.
But turning out stuff against the government in Egypt and against the Saudis and against the Emiratis. But these are not news channels in the ordinary sense of the word. They're propaganda channels. There's no pretense made at being fair and balanced. These are anti-regime channels that are there to try to bring down and discredit the regime. So if you tune into the Sudanese channel, for example, broadcasting from Turkey at Taiba, it's a channel that anything bad you can say about the reformist government that replaced the Islamist Bashir regime in Sudan, you can find on this network. The Egyptian ones are the same. You have some that are more religious, some that are more nationalist, but they're all anti-Sisi, they're all anti-regime and broadcast from Turkey.
You mentioned that the anti-Sisi, the anti-Egyptian government has its roots in it started about 6 to 7 years ago. Could you, particularly for people who are listening to this who are like, well, why? What caused that? Could you elaborate on that?
I would go back even a little further, but the diaspora or the migration to Turkey begins, of course, first in 2010, TRT starts an Arabic service. So maybe that's the first step, which is a natural thing for a national broadcaster to do. But then the second thing is the Syrian revolution, Syrian civil war of beginning in 2011, and that's another wave that leads to people moving to Turkey. And then you have the Egyptian government removing the Islamist Morsi regime in 2013. And so what happens is these Muslim brothers flee Egypt. They go to Qatar first and actually began to kind of organize themselves in Qatar and put out stuff, kind of in the first steps of doing so. But it's a problem. Qatar is an Arab country. It has, especially now, but back then it was still, kind of in the works, had a difficult relationship with its neighbors, had a difficult relationship with Egypt. So the Qataris basically encouraged these Muslim brothers to go from Qatar to Turkey, where they set up news outlets with Qatari money, but broadcasting from Istanbul. So that's the way it happens, It's a kind of a combination of Qatari cash, Turkish political space, safe haven, and exiled Islamist propagandists coming together to attack their enemies.
Let me ask, just in a general sense, do you see there's been some reporting recently in the news that the Turkish government was trying to put some restraint on the messaging coming out of the anti-Egyptians, and this was seen by some as an effort by Turkey to mend fences with the Sisi regime. Do you see anything to that, or?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. It's we've seen it over the past few weeks, and it's fascinating because you go from basically insanity world. I mean, you really have to see this stuff. It's not like Sisi is a dictator and he's bad kind of stuff. One of the stations from Istanbul had a long documentary about how the Rothschilds control the world. And the Rothschilds control Zionism, Nazism, communism, the Masons, the USA. And the guy broadcasting from Turkey holds up a chart, with all these arrows and stuff and everything. And basically, and he says the Rothschilds are behind all this stuff that has happened, behind all the wars, behind assassinations, from killing Napoleon. I did not know Napoleon was assassinated, but from defeating or destroying Napoleon to Lincoln to JFK, the Zionists, the Rothschild, I mean, basically what they're saying, the Jews, it's a classic anti-Semitic trope are behind it all. So this was the kind of stuff that we're putting out before. Well, in the last few weeks, as Turkey publicly has announced that it wants to improve its relations with the countries in the Arab world, and specifically Egypt, these guys on these networks are squirming, and actually there are videos of them, and it's hilarious to watch them because they've gone from being able to say any wacky, crazy, insane thing just a few months ago, right? Just 2 months ago, to having pressure, and they're expressing it. So you have a video of one of the main figureheads, saying, "I don't know what I'm going to do. I've been moved to London," which is they can continue doing that from there. But I'm just a poet. I don't care about politics. This is the guy who hosts, by the way, the Zionists control everything video. So definitely there is a message from on high in Turkey that these stations, which until very recently, we're talking just a matter of weeks ago, had carte blanche to lie, to exaggerate, to fabricate all kinds of crazy stuff about regimes in the Arab world, have basically been told to stop by the political authorities in Turkey. It's fascinating, of course, because it actually shows the level of control that these stations had by the government. In other words, it wasn't like, well, this is private media, we don't have anything to do with it. When the Turkish government wanted, these guys were putting out, the Rothschild control the world. When the Turkish government decided that they didn't want them to do it, it's like, basically, we can't say anything bad about Sisi.
Yeah, that's we'll see how far it goes, because I mean, I'm sure you remember that there was that Mavi Marmara incident.
Yes.
And at that time, there was still an active and fairly vibrant independent media in Turkey.
Yes.
So you were able to get different messages, but I think those days are over. It'd be interesting to see, how far the Turkish government goes in using media to kind of cozy up to Sisi.
Well, of course, what you turn off, you can also always turn back on.
Right, exactly, right. I mean, so it's worth following to say, well, okay, so was this just a blip? Were they just throwing this out as bait towards the Egyptians, or are they really making a decided change in direction of their messaging strategy?
Indeed.
Let's if we can, let's move on to something you kind of alluded to it, and that was how this messaging affects not just the relationship with Egypt, but also with Turkey's relations with others. And I was going to hold this as the last question, but I think I want to ask this first. How do you see the relationship? I mean, you served in a number of these places, going on right now between Turkey and the Gulf states, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Qataris.
Well, what's happened is, of course, it was a conscious decision made by Qatar and by Turkey to draw together in a kind of ideological alliance. I mean, the reality is that, you have the Muslim Brotherhood, the radicals of political Islam. They used to be supported by many of the regimes in the Arab world, including Saudi Arabia, including the UAE. But years ago, they decided this was a really bad idea, right? That these guys were going to try to overthrow us. They're subversive. They're subverting our society. So most of them stopped. Qatar did not stop. And what you had is, especially after the attempted coup against Erdogan, the failed coup, you had a drawing together of like-minded people. So you had the Saudis and the UAE and the Egyptians basically, washing their hands. The Muslim Brotherhood are the enemy. But you had the Qataris supporting them, and you had the Qataris and the Turks drawing together. So, I mean, basically, Turkish foreign policy in the Gulf was very much sublimated to Qatari policy in the Gulf, kind of very much drawing together. Obviously, the fact that Qatar, has lent Turkey $15 billion in currency swaps is a thing. But if you'd see, for example, Al Jazeera specialized in presenting Erdogan as this great figure in the Arab world, kind of just slavishly, uncritical, hagiographic kind of coverage, really softball marshmallow type of coverage. So this is what's happened. Basically, Qatar's enemies in the Gulf have become Turkey's enemies in the Gulf. And Turkey has embraced this kind of ideological fight that is going on in the Gulf world, which is a problem, right? I mean, it's not a problem for them if things are going well, if the Turkish economy is doing well, if Turkish is well connected with the world and liked by the world. But if you have poor relations with the Americans, the West, the Arabs, with Israel, your kind of sphere of influence is decreased. And while Qatar has a lot of money, Qatar alone cannot solve Turkey's economic and political problems.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's, when I was there, one of the things that happened was the beginning of the Syrian conflict. And no one paid a lot of attention to the impact it had on Turkish trade, except there's an organization in Ankara called TEPAV that looks at all this economic stuff. And I was speaking with them, and they were explaining to me that, Turkey was trying to expand its exports into the Gulf. Well, along comes the Syria thing. Well, everything went overland. So it went from Turkey into Syria, and then from Syria down into Saudi Arabia, and then over to the Gulfies, and some of it stayed in Saudi Arabia. Well, suddenly, and the shipping costs were something like $3,500 a container. Well, suddenly the shipping costs go up to $8,500 a container, because you've got to put it onto, a ship, sail it down through the Suez and up and around and all that, and that was expensive. There was a workaround that was exploited, but it never became public information, and that had to do with containers mysteriously arriving in Jordan with Turkish and Jordanian customs stamps seals on them, but they had not transited Syria. Because money really matters.
Look at a map.
Yeah, look at a map, and we'll let the listeners figure that out, how that could have taken place, and we were able to confirm that, that little piece of ground between the Mediterranean and Jordan was being exploited, because money matters, and unfortunately, the point you make about Erdogan and his relations, Qatar is not going to be able to bail them out. I don't know if you noticed that Erdogan just fired another finance minister, and for a moment the lira was trading at over 8 lira to the dollar, which, I mean, it's just. But anyway, so which I'll segue on that to the good old conflict in Syria, which is now a decade old, and I know many a Turkish diplomat who was adamant in saying that the conflict in Syria was going to be resolved in under a year when it first broke out. Well, that certainly didn't happen. So what do you think? Do you think the Turkish policies on Syria are going to be changing anytime soon, or?
I don't expect them to be changing anytime soon, but it's a fascinating story how it's evolved over time. There are pictures, you can find pictures, you can Google them, of Erdogan and Assad before the war, right? Just you can find them with the Saudis and others and stuff like that back in the day. The war started, Turkey, along with the Gulf states, and not just Qatar, Saudis as well, and others, went full in on regime change in Syria. It didn't happen for a variety of reasons, one of them being the Russian intervention, the intervention of Iran, the intervention of Hezbollah, all of which propped up a Syrian regime, which looked to be on its last legs. And according to what we've heard and what's been reported from the supporters of the Assad regime, it was on its last leg. So the Russians, the Iranians, and Hezbollah really saved Assad. The fascinating thing is that Turkey evolves, and Turkish priorities evolve from regime change, removing Assad, to the Kurdish question, where a hard line against the Kurds, going after the YPG and the SDF, becomes a priority. So you have this fascinating situation which happens where Turkey allows, until it goes too far and some Turkish soldiers are killed, but Turkey allows a kind of incrementalism to occur by Assad and his allies in pushing things back. And you see the fall of Aleppo, not that far from the Turkish border.
No.
You see millions of people fleeing into the Idlib pocket. And the sense that people in the Arab world, and certainly people in Syria has, is there's a kind of a deal, an unmentioned deal, maybe brokered by the Russians, which is basically you allow Assad to have a free hand in Aleppo, in nibbling away at that Idlib pocket. And meanwhile, we'll kind of look the other way at, Afrin, northeast Syria, all these different operations, Euphrates Shield and Olive Branch and Peace Spring. There's a kind of a trade-off. These are operations mostly against Kurds. I mean, one of them, Euphrates Shield, is against ISIS and against the Kurds. But of course, the reason it occurs is to prevent the Kurdish forces from having the entire Syrian border.
Right.
That's why they intervened. They didn't intervene against ISIS before. They intervened there because ISIS was on the verge of being defeated by the SDF, and SDF would have controlled the entire border area. So there's this fascinating trade-off that happens with Turkey being against the Assad regime, which is ostensibly it still is, but basically being a partner of the Assad regime and the Russians in saying, well, you can bomb Idlib, back to the Stone Age. You can do all of this stuff, but we're going to do stuff in the Kurdish areas, and that's kind of our trade-off. That's kind of the deal that we have. Fascinating situation.
Yeah, so I'm gonna ask a question that we hadn't talked about prior. In the last, say, year and a half, the rapprochement between Israel and some of its Arab, neighbors, or at least countries in the Middle East, well, it goes as far as Morocco, has taken place. And yet the perception I have is that Turkey has basically missed the opportunity, that this gradual movement of these Arab countries to kind of fix the relationship with Israel, it's been kind of in the background for a while. There's been clandestine meetings, and there's been, intel sharing by the Israelis with the Saudis, against Muslim Brotherhood and others, and it's borne fruit. And yet that doesn't seem to have moved the Turks. And I'm wondering what you think about the fact that, Israel is getting better relations with these Arab nations, or a significant number of them, and yet Turkey is its inability to kind of embrace the so-called Abraham Accords. What's driving that? Well,
actually, Turkey played a role in the Abraham Accords in a negative sense, which is that the Abraham Accords they're about peace between Israel and its Arab neighbors, of course, but they're also about the threat. And that's the Iranian threat, and also less mentioned, but also true, the Turkish threat. In other words, how these Arab states see themselves threatened by both Iranian aggression and Turkish aggression. And so you have these situations of where you have, these things you see where you see, the Saudis working with the Greek Air Force in Crete, right? Why are they doing that? Well, it's because of Turkey. So what Turkey's done is driven these countries together. Iran has done it as well, but so it's a kind of a, kind of the law of unintended consequences. You rattle your sabers, you threaten your neighbors, and surprise, your neighbors draw together against you because they take you at your word. They take this blood-curdling language and these actions on the ground at face value.
So, from your perspective as really an Arab nation's hand, I mean, somebody who really understands the Middle East from, in the Arab countries, what does Turkey have to do to really improve its relationship with Saudi Arabia, with Egypt, with the Emiratis?
There's a lot that can be done. You can think of a lot of practical things. But there's an initial big hurdle, which is the historical record of the past few years. I'm not talking about like the Ottoman Empire 100, 200 years ago, is what happened, kind of the aggressive, I'm looking at it from Arab eyes, the way the Arabs look at it, kind of the aggressive, intolerant, blustering, and real actions that Turkey has taken against Saudi Arabia, against Egypt. People are not going to, kind of just pretend that those things didn't happen when the guy who made them happen is still in power. So it's not impossible, obviously. Diplomacy is all about kind of making friends or finding shared interests. But it's a real problem. There's a huge obstacle. There's a huge credibility gap that Turkey faces. These people are going to say, yeah, you spent years turning up poison against us, allying with people we consider terrorists. Turkey considers the YPG terrorists. Well, Egypt considers the Muslim Brotherhood terrorists.
Right.
Saudi Arabia considers the Muslim Brotherhood terrorists. So it's going to take a little more than a kind of press release and honeyed words by the foreign minister to overcome what is seen as years of Turkish aggression against these Arab states. It's not impossible, but it's going to require some work.
And let me end with this question. Is there any likelihood of the U.S. kind of serving as an honest broker between the Turks and the Arab states to facilitate better relations? Or is that actually more likely to make it more difficult?
I don't see that it would make it more difficult. I see that there's a basic problem, and that is the relations between the United States and Turkey. You know better than me. I mean, where are they actually going in this new administration, and what exactly is the kind of framework of the new relationship? Yes, if it was old Turkey, which is part of the Western Alliance, Turkey, the NATO member, Turkey, the friend of the United States, of course, the United States could play that role. But does that Turkey still exist? Is that still the Turkey that calls the shots? That's the question.
Yeah, it's a great question, which I don't think we're going to be able to answer right now. Well, anyway, so is there anything you want to add, or before I kind of wrap up?
No, I think that's it. I've enjoyed it. I'm not a Turkey expert, but I certainly follow Turkey and the Arab world very closely. It's very interesting, obviously often very distressing, but it's an important country that plays an important role in the Middle East. Sadly, these days, often for ill rather than for good.
Yeah, we can talk about what I call the great conundrum, which is how those of us who consider ourselves friends of Turkey remain friends of Turkey when dealing with maybe, let's just say, the leadership that is less than friendly towards the United States and other democratic leaning countries. So Anyway, we'll leave it up with that. To all of our listeners, I hope you enjoyed this. I'm going to forewarn you that I'm hoping that sometime in the future I can get Ambassador Fernandez to come back and give us some more perspective of, the perspective on Turkey's behavior in the Middle East from the Arab eyes. Okay, and that's all. Again, Alberto, thank you very much, and it was fun.
Thank you.